evening. I'm Judy Woodruff. On the NewsHour tonight, threat assessment. The heads of U.S. intelligence outline the dangers posed by China, Russia, and Iran. Then, searching for a way out, Britain's parliament votes on competing plans to leave the European Union before a looming deadline. Plus, school districts are required by law to provide services for students with special needs. But not all meet those requirements, and when schools fail students with special needs from military families, results can be devastating.
I was responsible for the health and welfare of 3,000 sailors plus 2,000 additional deployers on our ship. And even though that was stressful, it was more stressful for me to think about my daughter, who was not being taken care of by the public school here.
All that and more on tonight's PBS NewsHour. Much of the American Midwest is in the grip of a visitor from the North Pole, and it is moving east. Forecasters warn the Arctic blast will mean the lowest temperatures in a generation. The deep freeze has descended. Ice choked waterways in Chicago today, and railway officials there set fires to keep frozen tracks from cracking. The frigid weather iced over the river in Detroit as well, and prompted warnings everywhere.
At these temperatures, even 10 minutes of exposure may very well be harmful.
All of this is the work of a polar vortex, a low-pressure mass that normally sits near the Earth's poles, moving from North Dakota to Ohio. By tomorrow, readings in Minnesota and the Dakotas are expected to fall to minus 30 degrees, with a wind chill of minus 60. Schools are taking no chances. They've already canceled classes in Minneapolis and St. Paul through at least Wednesday.
There could be many unintended, unforeseen things that take place that could potentially expose a child to dangerous temperatures for a prolonged period of time.
Wisconsin has declared a state of emergency, and so have Michigan and Illinois. The bitter cold has raised fears for the homeless. Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer visited a warming center in Lansing today.
This is an event unlike any we've seen in a generation, and I think it's really important that we protect people.
Snowplows have been busy, and dangerous roads caused chaos on Monday.
It's rough, slippery, and it's nasty. I'm hoping that it stops.
Air travel was also a casualty as icy runways canceled more than 1,000 flights at O'Hare International Airport. And Chicago police body cam footage captured the dramatic rescue of a man who jumped into Lake Michigan to save his dog. Temperatures are expected to plunge even lower on Wednesday. In the day's other news, President Trump's longtime friend and advisor Roger Stone pleaded not guilty to charges of obstruction, lying to Congress, and witness tampering. He was indicted as part of the special counsel's Russia investigation. Supporters and opponents greeted Stone as he arrived for his arraignment at federal court in Washington. He made no public statements. The Senate Judiciary Committee has put off a planned vote on the nomination of William Barr to be U.S. Attorney General. Democrats raised concerns today that Barr might not make public the special counsel's report on the Russia investigation when it's finished. Barr had criticized Robert Mueller's probe before being nominated. The committee vote is now set for next Tuesday. The Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell says he supports efforts to cut down on government shutdowns. He spoke today about various proposals in the House and the Senate to block any future closures.
I don't like shutdowns. I don't think they work for anybody, and I hope they will be avoided. I'd be open to anything that we could agree on a bipartisan basis that would make them pretty hard to occur again.
Congress now has less than 3 weeks to reach a deal on border security funding before the next shutdown deadline. Meanwhile, Stacey Abrams will deliver the Democratic Party response to President Trump's State of the Union address next Tuesday. Abrams narrowly lost the Georgia gubernatorial race in November. In Venezuela, the government's chief prosecutor called for a criminal investigation of opposition leader Juan Guaido. Last week, Guaido declared himself interim president of the country. So far, though, President Nicolas Maduro has refused to step down. Meanwhile, the UN says at least 40 have died in recent violence. It says 26 were killed by pro-government forces and more than 850 were detained. China demanded today that the U.S. stop what it called the unreasonable crackdown on tech giant Huawei. The company was indicted Monday on federal charges that it stole trade secrets and violated sanctions on Iran. Beijing warned that it will defend Chinese companies, but it gave no details. Back in this country, Chicago police are investigating a possible hate crime against Jussie Smollett. He's a star of the TV series Empire. He says two men assaulted him on a street early today. They allegedly shouted racial and homophobic slurs, poured an unknown substance on him, and tied a rope around his neck. Smollett later went to a hospital. He is reported in good condition. The nation's largest utility, Pacific Gas and Electric, filed for bankruptcy protection today. The utility faces hundreds of lawsuits over wildfires, even though state investigators say that its equipment did not cause a deadly 2017 fire in California. The bankruptcy filing could mean higher bills for consumers and smaller payouts to fire victims. And on Wall Street today, the Dow Jones Industrial Average gained 51 points to close near 24,580. The Nasdaq fell 57 points, and the S&P 500 slipped 3. Still to come on the NewsHour, the intelligence community gives its assessment of international threats to the U.S., critical Brexit votes in the British Parliament, the challenges faced by students with special needs from military families, and much more. Have a good day. Today, the leaders of the U.S. intelligence community testified to Congress for what's called an annual threat assessment and painted major dangers posed by North Korea, ISIS, and to U.S. election security. Some of their testimony highlighted the differences between President Trump's policies and the intelligence community's assessments. Here to help navigate the contradictions, our foreign affairs correspondent, Nick Schifrin. Nick, hello. So let's start with North Korea. We know the president has emphasized dialogue with the North. What is the intelligence community saying?
The intelligence community has long been skeptical of North Korea and long been skeptical that North Korea would ever be willing to give up its nuclear weapons because the intelligence community assesses that North Korea believes those nuclear weapons are an essential deterrent. And that's exactly what we heard today. So let's listen to the Director of National Intelligence, Dan Coates.
Kim Jong-un continues to demonstrate openness to the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Having said that, we currently assess that North Korea will seek to retain its WMD capabilities and is unlikely to completely give up its nuclear weapons and production capabilities because its leaders ultimately view nuclear weapons as critical to regime survival.
So that skepticism is obviously in contrast to President Trump's optimism. President Trump has said that Kim Jong-un was serious about denuclearization. But let's talk about a little bit history here. The last 4 presidents have gotten the same exact intelligence assessment that we heard today. President Clinton got the same assessment and yet decided eventually to talk with the North Koreans. President Bush got the same assessment and decided eventually to talk with the North Koreans. President Obama got it and really resisted that talk. So what President Trump and his allies say is, look, maybe they won't denuclearize, but we really need to give it a try. And of course, that's their policy decision. As for Kim Jong-un, he says we will consider denuclearization if the U.S. Improves diplomatic relations, reduces sanctions, and reduces U.S. military presence.
So ISIS, we know the president has declared victory over ISIS, particularly in Syria. What are we hearing from the intelligence officials?
Yeah, the president declared victory and declared we won in Syria. Vice President Pence has said the caliphate has crumbled. What the intelligence community did today was distinguish between the threat that ISIS poses to capture more territory and the threat that ISIS poses as an insurgent group or as a terrorist group. So here's the director of CIA, Gina Haspel, answering a question from Senator Susan Collins.
It is, of course, accurate that ISIS has suffered significant leadership losses and near total loss of territorial control. But of course, they're still dangerous, which is your point, and they're the largest Sunni terrorist group, and they still command thousands of fighters in Iraq and Syria.
And what President Trump is looking at is a military defeat. And that is what U.S. troops are in Syria to do, to fight ISIS. And that's what he promised, of course, during the campaign. What the intelligence community is saying is that this ongoing terrorist threat, insurgent threat, is much more difficult to tackle than just with the military. And they're admitting that that terrorist and insurgent threat will continue.
As well as the ideological threat that they pose. Iran, the president has ended U.S. role in the Iran nuclear agreement. What is the intelligence community saying about Iran's nuclear capacity?
The Trump administration has long said that Iran did not heed that 2014 nuclear deal and always wanted a nuclear weapon. But Gina Haspel, the CIA director, was much more nuanced. She said that Iran was complying with the deal, but that it might start enrichment in the future. So here is her talking with Senator Angus King, who's an independent but caucuses with Democrats.
Since our departure from the deal, they have abided by the terms. You're saying they're considering, but at the current moment, they're
yes, they're making some preparations that would increase their ability to take a step back if they make that decision. So at the moment, technically, they're in compliance, but we do see them debating amongst themselves as they fail to realize the economic benefits they hoped for from the deal.
And what Europe is trying to do is give Iran some of those economic benefits to try and keep Iran inside the deal. And the bottom line, as we just heard from the CIA director, Iran is abiding by that deal still.
And Nick, what about U.S. elections, the threat posed to those?
This has been a consistent warning, red light from the intelligence community. They have been very worried about the election security, both in 2018 and in 2020. And that was actually the first topic that the Director of National Intelligence raised today.
We assess that foreign actors will view the 2020 U.S. elections as an opportunity to advance their interests. We expect them to refine their capabilities and add new tactics as they learn from each other's experiences and efforts in previous elections.
Now, President Trump has not personally focused or talked about election security a lot, but the government, as well as private companies, like Twitter especially, have rallied in 2018 in ways that they didn't in 2016. But still, as we heard from today, the intelligence community very worried, especially that China, Russia, and Iran will continue cyber attacks, and there's simply not much they can do to prevent those from happening.
Well, one thing the president has talked about, of course, is the southern border. He has called it a national security threat, but that didn't come up today?
It barely came up. I mean, the intelligence community spent a lot of time talking about Russia and China, the threats that they pose. They said that they're working together more than in the last 70 years or so. They talked about North Korea, as we talked about, Iran and election security, but the word border did not come up at all in the opening statement by the Director of National Intelligence, Dan Coats, and nobody repeated the president's language that the border poses a major threat to the United States.
Fascinating. Nick Schifrin, thank you.
Thank you.
The British Parliament debated a number of proposals today on how to proceed with regard to leaving the European Union. In the end, they voted to authorize the Prime Minister to go back to the European Union to try to get a better deal. Special correspondent Ryan Chilcote is in London and has our report.
Another raucous Brexit debate in the British Parliament. This time, up for consideration, two competing paths for the United Kingdom's withdrawal from the European Union. It came exactly 2 months before Britain has to leave the EU, and 2 weeks after Prime Minister Theresa May's plan suffered the worst parliamentary defeat in British history. Since then, members from all sides have been offering ideas. Today, they voted on more than half a dozen proposals.
I believe that we are within reach of a deal that this House can stand behind. But the days ahead are crucial.
The first major proposal today, keep the Prime Minister in charge of the process, but send her back to the EU to renegotiate better terms. The second alternative, give May another month to secure a deal to Parliament's liking. Failing that, turn the future of Brexit over to Parliament and extend the deadline. Something she says would be a betrayal of
I am not prepared to stand still and put at risk either the Brexit the people of this country voted for or the economic success the people of this country have worked so hard to secure.
May has refused to step aside, but acknowledged that Parliament must have more say in the final deal. The first plan, keeping May in charge of Brexit, calls for her to seek a better agreement from the EU on what is called the Irish backstop. Right now, Northern Ireland, which is part of the United Kingdom and still part of the European Union, and the Republic of Ireland, also part of the EU, have no land border, so cars and goods can cross easily. May's original Brexit plan would have kept that border open when the UK leaves the EU, as it has been ever since the Good Friday Agreement that brought an end to the Troubles in Ireland 20 years ago. But some conservative politicians have rejected that part of the agreement focused on the border, saying it could leave Britain subject to European Union trade rules indefinitely. In an effort to win over those conservatives today, May pledged to do something she has up to now said will never work.
Negotiating such a change will not be easy, but I believe that with a mandate from this House and supported by the Attorney General, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster and the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union, I can secure such a change in advance of our departure from the EU.
The European Union has refused to budge on the backstop. Less than an hour after May's comments today, EU officials shut it down once again. Still, there is growing concern that if Britain crashes out of the EU on March 29 without a formal agreement, food shortages, plummeting house prices, and economic distress could follow. That's why some lawmakers, including opposition and Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn, are trying to force May's government to delay Britain's exit from the EU.
Labour will today back amendments that attempt to rule out this government's reckless option of allowing the UK to crash out without a deal. Everyone bar the Prime Minister accepts that this would be disastrous.
Delaying Brexit would mean extending the so-called Article 50 that triggered the withdrawal process. But Corbyn rebuffed efforts from some in his own party to call for a second Brexit referendum.
The ayes to the right, 317. The noes to the left, 301. So the ayes have it.
Against all odds, the Prime Minister succeeded in mustering the support she needed for the idea of her going back to the EU to renegotiate the deal. It's her first win in a long while. She'll be hoping the EU's insistence that it wouldn't negotiate anymore was just a bluff.
So success today for the Prime Minister, but definitely not an unqualified success, because at the end of the day, she has to get the European Union to agree to change a deal that she already agreed to. Judy?
So, Ryan, what are the prospects then of the EU being willing to renegotiate, and what are her prospects of getting a better deal for leaving the EU?
Well, listen, if you look to listen to their rhetoric, if you listen to the EU's rhetoric, the prospects are very dim. They have been very clear, even after this vote, in saying that there will be no change to the deal. She agreed to it. They agreed to it. It's done as far as they're concerned. And remember, we're talking about 27 countries on the other side of the negotiating table. So it's difficult to see how that could change. But what she will be betting on is that when she goes back, she'll say, look, I finally showed you that I can get a majority in the parliament for a deal. We can agree amongst ourselves on something, and that's the deal that we have already agreed with you. If you agree to change this one little thing, she will describe it as, and that's the Irish backstop. But again, they've said no change to that. She's just hoping that, they're bluffing.
So, Ryan, what happens if she doesn't get a better deal? Then what?
Well, if she doesn't get a better deal, then things get complicated. She will come back to the Houses of Parliament on February the 13th. That's what she's talking about now, is coming back for another meaningful vote where they will vote on whatever she has, whether it was the old deal or a slightly tweaked deal with some maybe declarations on the side of it, but without any legal changes to it, and see if she can get that through. Of course, she is unlikely to get it through, and then
she'll have to negotiate again with all the members of the parliament. And then we'll be looking at other options, including running down the clock closer to March the 29th, when no matter what, the UK, as things stand now, has to leave the European Union.
And very quickly, Ryan, prospects for another referendum in the UK on this?
Very interesting. Doesn't seem to be the appetite for that right now. There was an initiative today that was voted on in the Houses of Parliament, and the parliamentarians said, no, that's not something we want to consider right now. I think the most likely thing is that if she doesn't have a deal by March the 29th, you could start to see some changes in the Parliament trying to either extend the UK's relationship with the EU so they can continue to negotiate, or maybe even put it back to the people for a vote, but not right now. Right now, it's basically Theresa May lives another day to continue her fight.
Ryan Chilcote reporting for us from the Parliament. Thank you, Ryan. We turn now to Capitol Hill. With the federal government reopened, lawmakers today were focused on committee hearings and legislative agendas. But the pressure to avoid a second shutdown hangs over Congress. To discuss all this and more, I'm joined by Republican Senator Susan Collins of Maine. Senator Collins, welcome back to the NewsHour. So first question, what do you think the prospects are of another shutdown in 3 weeks?
I'm very optimistic that we can avoid another shutdown. Shutdowns are never justified, no matter what the cause may be. And I believe that those who thought a shutdown would be worthwhile have been disabused of that notion.
Do you know, Senator, what the Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, was referring to today when he said he would like to see shutdowns made more difficult in these kind of budget negotiations? Is there some kind of plan in mind?
There are a couple of bills that have been introduced that would have a mechanism by which government would go on what we call a continuing resolution, a stopgap funding at the current levels in order to avoid any shutdown. And there's a lot of interest in how we could craft that to ensure that this is the last shutdown that our country will ever endure.
You think that could get done in 3 weeks?
I do. I believe that we can come up with a compromise that will allow us to fund some of the president's border security initiative, as well as to fund the remainder of government for the rest of the fiscal year through September 30th. And part of that package may well be some sort of legislation that has a mechanism to ensure that no matter what the policy disputes may be, that there will not be a future shutdown.
Well, I want to ask you about the president's demand for money for border security, because he is continuing to say there has to be money here for some kind of physical barrier at the border. Democrats, as you know, are saying no money for a physical barrier. Do you think the president could, in the end, be prepared to give on that?
I think there is plenty of room for a compromise on this issue. You have Speaker Nancy Pelosi saying not $1 for any kind of physical barrier, despite the fact that we have built 654 miles of physical barriers, fences for the most part, in the last two administrations, both President Obama and President Bush's administration. And then you have the president asking for $5.7 billion for some sort of wall or steel fence. There's a lot of room between not $1 and $5.7 billion.
So you think the Democrats are going to need to do the giving? Is that what you're saying? That they're going to end up putting some money on the line?
I think both sides. After all, I keep in mind that just this past summer, in the Appropriations Committee in the Senate, we approved a bill for the Homeland Security Department that included $1.6 billion for physical barriers, as well as other means of strengthening our border security. The president's plan is actually $7 billion beyond that, because it includes more border patrol agents, immigration judges, sensors, roads to remote areas, new technology. We need an all-of-the-above approach, and I believe that people of goodwill can come together and come up with a package.
Well, we're all anxious to know what that in-between language is going to be. Senator, several other things I want to ask you about very quickly. We heard the acting attorney general say this week that he believes the special counsel's investigation, Robert Mueller's investigation, will be wrapping up soon. Do you know whether that's true or not?
I really don't. Certainly the special counsel has handed down a number, or has secured, I think, 34 indictments and some convictions, and it might well be logical that he's at the point where he's wrapping up his investigation, but I don't know that for certain.
And a completely different topic, Senator, we're seeing a large number of Democrats express interest in running for president. In 2020, we are even hearing conversation from Republicans who may be thinking about challenging President Trump for the nomination, Republican nomination. Are you at this point prepared to endorse President Trump?
I'm really focused on my own campaign for 2020. And I really haven't focused on the presidential campaign. So I'm not prepared at this point to make that decision.
But do you expect at some point between now and November of 2020 to endorse the president, since you're a Republican?
I don't know. I'm going to have to see what happens between now and then, and look at what his record is. I can't imagine that I would endorse any of the Democrats who are running right now, but I'm going to focus on 2020 and 2020.
But you're leaving the door open to perhaps supporting another Republican.
Well, I'm just not focused on it, Judy, right now, so I'm neither ruling it in nor ruling it out.
All right, Senator Susan Collins of Maine, thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Judy.
Stay with us. Coming up on the News Hour, renewed efforts to pass the Equal Rights Amendment. A conversation with Sandeep Johar, cardiologist and author of the book, Heart, A History. And I speak with 3 governors about working across the aisle with the other party. Navigating a school system can be challenging for any parent with a child who has special needs. But for military families, that stress is compounded by their lifestyle of repeated moves and attending different schools that offer varying levels of services. In her second report focusing on military kids, special correspondent Kavitha Cardoza with our partner Education Week reports from Virginia Beach, Virginia, where a third of children in need of special education services can fall through the cracks. It's part of our education series, Making the Grade.
Good to see you soon. See you. All right, have a good day.
After years of military moves, Navy Captain Cassidy Norman was posted to Virginia Beach.
Bye-bye.
The Normans had lived here before, and their daughter loved her former school. 14-year-old Marissa has several disabilities, including cerebral palsy, severe anxiety, poor eyesight, and hearing.
So her disabilities are all compounded in the classroom. It's difficult for her to listen and learn and write all at the same time.
Marissa needs one-on-one help and therapies, but she has normal intelligence, which means with patience and educational accommodations, she can learn just like any of her classmates. Virginia Beach is surrounded by bases, and the economy is closely tied to the military. Its schools have several programs to support military kids, but several service members say the district is not meeting the needs of their children with disabilities. Eileen Huck with the National Military Family Association says obtaining special education services is a significant challenge for service members nationwide.
So often I hear from families who had things set at their previous location, and then they had to move, and then they feel as though they're starting from scratch.
The military does consider a child's medical and educational needs during assignments.
But there is less attention paid to the special education services because federal law says that all school districts are required to provide a free and appropriate public education.
All children with special needs in every public school district are entitled to an evaluation and individualized plan detailing the supports they'll receive. But when Marissa returned to Virginia Beach District, her parents noticed right away something was wrong.
We weren't getting progress reports. They kept taking away services and goals from her and from her education plan.
It was very frustrating.
And at the same time, they would give her honor roll and student of the month every once in a while. But all of this time, she was stagnating and in some areas regressing.
Cassidy had to leave for training and was then deployed to the Middle East. Still, he would call into meetings about Marissa, which he said school officials often postponed or cancelled. More than a year passed, and nothing significant changed. The Normans moved Marissa to a private school. They also hired a lawyer.
And I was so depressed. I wasn't myself. And I was crying all the time. I had to go see a therapist. And Cass was so worried about me. He had to send a base chaplain to come to speak to me.
During this case, I was responsible for the health and welfare of 3,000 sailors plus 2,000 additional deployers on our ship. And even though that was stressful, it was more stressful for me to think about my daughter, who was not being taken care of by the public school here.
Aaron Spence is superintendent of Virginia Beach City Public Schools.
Well, I want to be clear. We actually do a great job with our special education program at Virginia Beach. And on rare occasion, we have some disagreements and differences with our families. Fortunately, we have a great system for working through that.
Some military families here disagree. Bryn Bennett, Adriana Rodriguez, and Sydney Gilson all have children with special needs.
A few weeks after my husband left for deployment, my son was having some sort of breakdown in the classroom. They couldn't get him to calm down. And I got there and they had chairs kind of lined up. It was almost like he was a caged animal.
To watch the people that I know are supposed to be on his side, the one that are supposed to be helping him, and to see them pushing his buttons and upsetting him to such lengths was upsetting.
They didn't listen to a word we had to say. They didn't listen to a word his doctors had to say. They didn't offer any support.
The district would not comment on any of the cases, saying it would be inappropriate because we remain in litigation and due process with many of these families. But in a written statement, a spokesperson said the school district is committed to providing the best learning environment possible for all children. We have nationally recognized partnerships with our local installations and are acknowledged as a premier provider of services in the military community. But in one complaint which included military families, investigators found Virginia Beach schools were offering only the bare minimum in services, which translated into a deficit education. Advocate Eileen Huck says there are school districts that just wait it out.
It's unfortunate, but I think it's sometimes true that school districts will be hesitant to provide a new service or a new resource to a family that they know is going to be moving out of the district in a year or two.
We are not activists. We are not looking for a fight. We're looking for a good community.
It's rare for a family to file a formal complaint and even more rare for them to win. But a Virginia Department of Education investigation found the school district had not provided the minimum education required by law for Marissa. The school district appealed, the Normans won again in federal court, and Virginia Beach was ordered to pay for her private school. Marissa had to repeat a grade in her new school, but now she's doing well.
She plays on the volleyball team.
She's making friends. She's learning.
Providing special education services can be expensive for school districts, but as the Normans say, it's federal law. They say Virginia Beach schools have already spent more than $300,000 just on their case. The Normans say they hear from many other military families.
And very few, if any, are able to afford a lawyer. It's been depressing to see all the families that cannot fight the fight that we are fighting, and all the families that have given up or that are afraid of retribution and will not speak out.
Virginia Beach School District recently stopped paying for Marissa's private school and is appealing the verdict, which means another long court case that Michelle will have to deal with on her own, because Cassidy Norman has just received transfer orders for a 15-month posting on a ship based in Italy. For the PBS NewsHour and Education Week, I'm Kavita Cardoza in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
It was almost 100 years ago in 1923 that Alice Paul, a leader of the women's suffrage movement, first introduced to the public an idea of what would eventually become the proposed Equal Rights Amendment. The rising voices of women, the passage of civil rights laws, and the power of organized labor all helped to build momentum in the 70s when it passed Congress. But opposition also mounted over time as state legislatures faced ratification votes. The ERA ran out of steam and hit a wall. Now, as Amna Nawaz reports, there's new energy to try one more time to get it ratified.
It was over 40 years ago that Congress approved the Equal Rights Amendment, or ERA, and women took to the streets to get it ratified as a constitutional amendment.
So as we march today, remember, forward together, backward never.
First Lady Betty Ford argued for it in 1975.
By the end of this century, I hope this nation will be a place where men and women can freely choose their life's work without restriction and without ridicule.
The ERA would guarantee protection from sex discrimination in the Constitution, something not explicitly stated elsewhere. It says, quote, equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. But before it could be enshrined in the Constitution, the ERA needed 3/4 of all states, 38 total, to ratify it. Congress set a deadline for that goal. The ERA came up 3 states shy by the original deadline in 1979. 1982 saw a deadline extension. Still, the ERA fell short. But the largely latent campaign to ratify the ERA picked up steam again 2 years ago, partly due to the Me Too movement. Nevada became the 36th state to ratify it in 2017, followed by Illinois last year. Supporters had hoped Virginia would be the 38th state to ratify it, but last week, Virginia failed to push it through. There are now several bills in Congress to either extend or work around the deadline. Jackie Speer, a California Democrat, introduced one.
Why is this important? Because under the law in this country today, women need to not only show that there is discrimination in order to win a victory in court, they need to show that the discrimination was intentional. And that is a very high bar to make.
5 states that ratified the ERA decades ago have since rescinded those votes. If a 38th state stepped in now, the battle could move to court. There's still opposition to the ERA. Some conservatives oppose it, arguing it could overturn abortion restrictions, that the deadline to ratify has long passed, and that the ERA would make it more difficult to separate sexes in some facilities. We'll examine some of those claims in a moment, but first, let's hear about the push to pass the ERA from Kate Kelly, an attorney working on these issues for the group Equality Now. Welcome to the NewsHour. Thanks for having me. So we just heard there Virginia was widely believed to be that 38th state, right? That was going to push it over the finish line. Does it have to be Virginia? Could another state step in right now and get the ERA over that line?
There are 13 states that are yet to ratify, so any of those states could ratify and be the one to push it over the finish line to get the 3/4 necessary. It's not quite dead in Virginia yet. Okay. It did fail in one of the committees, but the Speaker of the House could still bring it to the floor. There's another option with a rule change that they're going to try to get. So it's not 100% dead in Virginia. We're still crossing our fingers. But there's also North Carolina has a bill. Arizona has a bill coming up this session. And so there are lots of hopes in several of the states.
And what about some of the other states we heard about, those 5 that say they rescinded their votes? Does that take away from the 38 tally?
So there are states that attempted to rescind before the original deadline had passed, but there's a really good, robust legal argument that rescissions don't count. In fact, with 3 amendments, previous amendments, states attempted to rescind and they didn't. For example, with the 14th Amendment, 2 states attempted to rescind and they were not counted. They just counted in the final passage. So they were listed among the states that had ratified.
So there's a couple of legislative efforts being introduced to try to push this through now, right? There's one that would remove the deadline altogether. There's another one that would restart the entire ratification process. Do either of those stand a chance, and how do they change the landscape?
Essentially, the ERA is going to happen. The question is, do we get to start from where we left off in 1972? Or do we have to start over, pass a new ERA, and have it ratified by 3/4 of the states? So, in my opinion, it is going to happen. Like Susan B. Anthony said, failure is impossible. But the question is how. So the deadline removal bill is Jackie Spears' bill, and that would simply eliminate that 1982 deadline that was put in place by Congress. The deadline was originally in the preamble to the ERA, so it's not what the states ratified. It wasn't considered. It wasn't part of the actual amendment. So Congress put it in. They can take it out. The other strategy by Representative Maloney is to start over with a new ERA, pass it in both houses, and then send it to the states for ratification.
But it would be the same in language and intention. It's just starting the process anew.
But Representative Maloney's bill is actually new. The original ERA, which was written in 1923 by Alice Paul and then eventually passed, did not have the word women in it. And so Representative Maloney's bill actually puts the word woman into the Constitution.
It might come as a shock to a lot of people that the Constitution doesn't actually guarantee those same rights and protection. As someone who's advocating for the passage of this, do you find that that is a huge obstacle? It's just reminding people that's the current landscape?
Over 80% of Americans think we already have an Equal Rights Amendment and that it passed and that it's in the Constitution. So overcoming that barrier of educating people and letting them know actually women are not protected to the fullest extent under the Constitution comes as a shock to most people.
So you heard me hint at some of those opposition arguments to this, right? That it would complicate other matters down the line. This is why some people oppose it. And a lot of people say, look, progress has been made in a lot of states without the ERA. We've narrowed the pay gap. A number of states have basically passed their own version of the ERA. So why is this still necessary?
24 states have their own version of the ERA. However, in many of the ways that we've made progress are up and under assault right now. For example, we've relied on Title IX. Title IX is under attack. We've relied on Equal Pay Act. A lot of these piecemeal types of legislation are at the whim of the people in Congress. So they could be changed at any time. They could be defunded at any time. But what can't be changed and what's a permanent protection is something that we put in the Constitution. When you think of other amendments like the Second Amendment or the First Amendment and how powerful those are to protect those rights, that's what we would have for women.
So you're worried all those other smaller legal issues that you've been relying on, if they get undermined, those states get undermined and those protections too.
Yeah, and state ERAs only apply to that state. So the federal Constitution protects every woman and girl in the United States of America. Whereas if you live in a state that doesn't have an ERA, or if your state ERA is somewhat lacking, you're not protected.
Kate Kelly of Equality Now. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
It's time now for the latest installment of our NewsHour New York Times Book Club. Now read this. Jeffrey Brown has our conversation.
Heartbreak, heart attack, heart transplant. It's an organ that, yes, is at the heart of our health and emotional life and the subject of centuries of medical research. It's also the subject of our January Book Club selection, Heart, a History. Author Dr. Sandeep Johar is here to answer some of the questions our readers sent in. And first, welcome and thanks for doing this with us.
Thank you for having me.
Give us an overview of what you were after. You're looking at the heart as metaphor, as mechanics, as science. What were you doing?
I've always been fascinated by the human heart, and so I wanted to write about it. And my fascination sort of stems from 3 reasons, really. One is that I have a malignant family history of heart disease. My grandfather paternal grandfather died when my father was only 14, years before I was born. I never met him. And his death really affected my father and, by extension, all of us as I was growing up. So the family history played a role. I'm also just fascinated by the fact that the heart is just such an amazing machine. It's really the most amazing machine that nature has devised. I mean, it's a machine that pumps 3 billion times in a typical human lifetime. And finally, I was just really fascinated, and I learned this more as I was researching the book, by the history of heart discovery.